Welcome back. When I was a young man, and I mean a much younger man, maybe like 40 years ago, back in the 80s, there was something of a renaissance of stand-up comedy, and I really enjoyed the comedians back in those days. It was all over TV and the nightclubs and so forth. I was working as a musician back then. So I'm now Catholic 20 plus years, almost 30 years, and doing this program. But I think it's funny, no pun intended, that a comedian from back in those days should be the recipient of our first ever Even a Broken Clock is Right Twice a Day award. And, this week I read an article on LifeSite News about comedian Bill Maher. Not somebody that you would think of as an award winner on a Catholic podcast. But, back in the day, long before my conversion, I was still pretty conservative, but I enjoyed Bill Maher. And for two reasons. Number one, back in those days, you couldn't use, profanity or the kind of vulgarity that are so common these days on broadcast television. So, comedy in general was more palatable. But even though Maher was a lot more liberal than me, he was among the first comedians to, make fun of the emerging phenomenon of political correctness way back in the 1980s. And, especially politically incorrect speech, so-called. Because the whole idea of speech codes and all that deserves to be mocked. And because, from his aspect, without free speech, there isn't any comedy. You have to understand there's a difference between political correctness and social convention. When I was a boy, it was understood that there are certain topics that you didn't discuss in polite company. Sex, politics, religion, right? But those taboo topics have always been the heart and soul of comedy. You think of Henny Youngman's famous one-liner, take my wife, please. Or even all the way back to Will Rogers when he said, I'm not a member of an organized political party, I'm a Democrat. And you can imagine how many jokes, the 1,000 jokes that begin a priest, a minister, and a rabbi walk into a bar, and so forth. Humor is about kind of popping the balloon of pomposity. It's about turning things on their head. And comedy's only funny if there's an element of truth in it. And to paraphrase G.K. Chesterton, it is the sign of a healthy religion or political party or social group or whatever to be able to laugh at itself. I come from a long line of cowboys, and I know that it is possible to cross the line. As my father used to say, some things ain't funny. But in general, if you can't take a joke, there's something wrong with you. And that's why so much of what passes for comedy these days is simply not funny, because it's not about the truth. It's not about the foibles of, the human foibles of people, whether they're left, right, or center. It's just a lot of vulgarity and profanity and increasingly virtue signaling. Do you ever wonder why the jokes, if you watch one of those late night talk shows and the guy comes out to do his monologue, and every joke is greeted with this uproarious laughter and wild applause. Why is that? It didn't used to be like that. And the reason is, Johnny Carson back in the day, he's only agenda was to entertain his audience. And he actually had an audience. But, today, those late night talk show hosts don't so much have an audience as they have a tribe. And so every piece of mean-spirited invective masquerading as humor has to be greeted with unrestrained enthusiasm, so that the audience can prove that they're good members of the tribe. It's kind of like people back in the old Soviet Union who would rather pass out from exhaustion than risk being the first one to stop applauding for Stalin. Okay, now back to Bill Maher. On Friday on his program Real Time, which is the successor to his previous program, aptly titled Politically Incorrect. I'm sorry, I'm working with rented lips today. Hang on. Get a little moisture in there. He said the most controversial thing that a liberal today can say. He said, pro-lifers do not hate women. Now, one of his guests, senator from Minnesota named Amy Klobuchar, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce her name. He said to her, I'm certainly pro-choice. What I'm saying is you shouldn't say the other side to the other side, you people hate women. They don't hate women. They think abortion is murder. And if you think it's murder, then you can't go, well, except for people with a uterus. They can commit murder, right? He said, I don't think it's murder, but they legitimately do, and it insults them, to be told that they hate women. And that kind of candor really is refreshing from someone on the left who is both, pro-abortion and an avowed atheist. But it was intolerable to his guests. The senator tried to throw up the liberal smokescreen by bringing up the phony position of people like Biden and Pelosi, for example. She said, there are pro-life people who have the view that's fine. They just don't think that they should put their views on someone else. And Maher pointed out the obvious. He said, but you wouldn't say that about a murderer. And that's what their point is. It's not because they hate women. At which point, Rob Reiner, actor, comedian, also a guest on the program, said that pro-lifers are trying to foist a Christian nationalist agenda on America. Remember that abortion was illegal everywhere on the earth until, roughly 50 years ago. And Maher, again, disagreed. He said, not everyone who is pro-life is a Christian nationalist, which is obviously true. Muslims are against abortion, and they're hardly Christian nationalists. So I want to just point out that Bill Maher, for all his faults, he's one of an emerging group of liberals who are refusing to get caught up in some of the irrational sides of liberalism, like the transgender nonsense, because they can see that it's irrational. Now, according to a LifeSite News article, and when the show gets posted, it'll be in the show notes. You can follow the link. Maher took a lot of heat from liberals last May because he devoted an entire segment of his show to opposing the insanity of, quote unquote, gender transitioning children. And again, any person of goodwill should be against that. Last February, he actually defended the legislation put forward by Ron DeSantis down in Florida, prohibiting teachers from teaching teaching about sexuality to children in the third grade and younger, or younger than the third grade. As if third graders need to hear about this, and Maher said that he understands the parents' concerns. And he is himself understandably very uncomfortable with trans activist rhetoric about protecting kids from their parents, right? As any rational person would be. So although I disagree profoundly with Bill Maher on almost everything, a whole host of issues, No Nonsense Catholic is awarding him the first ever Even a Broken Clock is Right Twice a Day award for having the courage to go against the liberal tribe and defend common sense regarding the fact that being pro-life does not mean that you hate women. Okay, and then I'm going to take a quick drink here, wet my whistle. Not wet, but wet. And we're going to go to our next award. And as you know, this podcast is called No Nonsense Catholic. And there is a special word that describes the type of nonsense that we oppose on this program. It can be found in Webster's under B, right between the words bulwark and bullfinch. Okay, and so our next award is called the Webster's Has a Word for It Award. And the very first Webster's Has a Word for It award is being presented to Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, who will play a central role at next year's gathering of the world's bishops for the Synod on Synodality. At a Vatican press conference on Friday, August 26, Cardinal Hollerich insisted that he had no personal agenda for the synodal process. This was in answer to a question that somebody raised regarding comments that he made last February, wherein he said, and I quote, he believes the sociological scientific foundation of the Church's teaching on homosexuality is no longer correct, unquote. Therefore, it follows logically that he must also believe that the Church's doctrine on homosexuality is itself incorrect. Now, he was singing a different tune last Friday when he said, quote, I fully believe in the tradition of the Church, and what is important, I think, in this process is not a change of doctrine. But what is important is to listen to everybody, to listen also to the suffering of people. I think of parents, for instance, of people concerned, and to have a change not of doctrine, but a change of attitude, that we are a church where everybody can feel at home. So I am not in favor of changing any doctrine. I am in favor for a church where really everybody can feel welcome," unquote. Although he did add that this welcome does not mean that there cannot be, quote, "discussions and different positions," unquote. Now, the elephant in the room that was not addressed is pretty clear. First, that the cardinal was named to an important post in the Bishop's Synod precisely after he made his public comments against the Church's teaching on homosexuality. And secondly, that he conflates doctrines with opinions. A doctrine is by definition a teaching that must be held by the Catholic faithful, and that includes bishops. Catholics do not get to pick and choose which doctrines they will or won't believe. There's a word in Greek which means to pick and choose. It's heresy. So, and also Cardinal Hollerich never said that he accepts the Church's teaching, Church's doctrine on homosexuality, but rather that he is, quote, "not in favor of changing doctrines generally." So, as though the Church has the authority to change doctrines at all. However, looked at in light of his position that the sociological, scientific foundation of the Church's teaching on homosexuality is no longer correct, his call for not a change of doctrine but a change of attitude suggests that he's looking for a church where doctrines don't have to be changed, but they also don't have to be acknowledged if they make you feel unwelcome, which is nonsense. The kind of nonsense that you find in Webster's Between Bulwark and Bullfinch. St. Paul said in the book of Romans that the pagan preoccupation with sodomy and the dreadful spiritual and physical consequences that follow, he said that itself was a divine punishment. Doctrines matter because actions have consequences. Also, if you look at the summaries of the continental European bishops' conferences that have come in regarding this synod of synodality, there's a marked divide between Eastern and Western Europe where doctrine is concerned. Eastern European Catholics mostly want to see doctrine and church structure remain intact, whereas some of the Western European Catholics are looking for the church to accept divorce and remarriage, so-called homosexual marriage, put an end to priestly celibacy, and so on, which, to be consistent, would mean the acceptance of Catholic priests entering into so-called homosexual marriages. Not just married priests, but priests in homosexual unions, which I fear is precisely what this is all about. Not just listening to Catholic parents of homosexual children or priests that struggle with homosexual attraction, which the church does anyway, but accepting or even celebrating that act of homosexuality. Okay, finishing up with this and coming back with 10 memorable sayings of our Lord right after this. Stay with us, No Nonsense Catholic, on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.